Our next lesson in the Civil War is called Atlanta and the Shenandoah Valley. Our objectives are to describe the significant events in the Atlanta campaign, recall the various battles that took place in the Shenandoah Valley. Look at your vocabulary words. The confidence or optimism level of an individual is morale. A person or event that goes before any others is a precursor. A leftover piece of something is remnant. A small sign or trace of something that is now missing is a vestige. Okay, have you ever had the opportunity of seeing a sheepdog herding sheep? It really is quite a sight. The dog seems to be running in circles, back and forth in 100 directions at once. While this is happening, the sheep are moving in a smaller and smaller area toward a pen. The dog is frantically racing around, drawing nearer to the sheep as they close in on the pen's gate. In a short time, all the sheep are securely in the pen as the owner locks the gate. Mission accomplished. But as you study today's lesson, you'll find a similar occurrence in the Atlanta campaign conducted by Union General William Sherman. His goal was not a holding pen, but the city of Atlanta. He planned to drive the Confederate Army back towards the city in a series of maneuvers with as little bloodshed as possible. At the same time, another campaign was underway in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Confederate and Union forces would clash here a number of times, with the South eventually being driven out of the area. The area Confederate forces were being allowed to operate in was narrowing ever so slowly. So it's kind of like that sheepdog. He runs around the sheep, and the area the sheep are in gets smaller and smaller so they can go through the gate of the pen. And that's what they're doing to the Confederates. The Union is shrinking the area where the Confederates can be. Okay? So in your notes, I want today's date. And today we're going to talk about the Atlanta campaign. From the beginning, William Sherman understood Joseph Johnston's reluctance to get into a major battle. He wasn't about to attempt messy frontal assaults either. Instead, Sherman decided to make a series of maneuvers that would gradually force the Confederate Army back toward Atlanta. Sherman's campaign to capture Atlanta stretched from May to July with little to show for it. In July, though, fate seemed to play in his hands. On July 18th, Confederate President Davis removed General Joseph Johnston as commander of the troops surrounding Atlanta. Davis had grown tired of Johnston's defensive tactics. He felt the only way to save the Southern cause was by victories won on the battlefield, not playing a waiting game. Davis wanted a man who would take the battle to the Union. A General John B. Hood was such a man. Okay. So Sherman's goal was to force the Confederate Army back towards Atlanta. So Sherman, and remember, he's Union. We can put a U here for Union. Sherman's goal was to force Confederates back to Atlanta. Oh, and it said that General Johnston, was replaced with General Hood. So he was replaced with General Hood. Although Although Hood was a proven fighter, the change actually worked to Sherman's advantage. He had by far the superior force, and if the South was going to try to take the war to him, Atlanta was sure to fall. Okay. Now remember, General Lee, General Lee's a Confederate. General Lee wanted Hood to take the battle to the Union. Let me make sure I have that right. Davis wanted a man who would take the battle to the Union. To the Union. I said Lee, but really it was Jefferson Davis. So I better put Davis here. Remember, Jefferson Davis is the president of the Confederacy. After a series of battles with Johnson and then Hood, Sherman was able to slowly corral the Confederate Army outside Atlanta and sever all railroad lines going to Atlanta. Once this was accomplished, Sherman began to swing his troops around to Hood's rear, hoping to trap the entire army in Atlanta. Okay, so the Atlanta campaign, remember Sherman's on the Union Army. His goal is to force the Confederates back to Atlanta. General Johnson was replaced with General Hood. The Confederates, Davis wanted Hood to take the battle to the Union. Okay. So we have a series of battles. And in the battles, Sherman had driven the Confederate Army outside of Atlanta. Okay, so there's a series of battles. Okay, and the accomplishments were Sherman have moved the Confederate Army outside of Atlanta. He severed all railroad lines going to Atlanta. Severed railroad lines going to Atlanta. Okay. Okay, now Sherman's goal is to swing his troops around to Hood's rear. That means to have his troops go behind Hood, and he wanted to trap his entire army in Atlanta. Sensing the events as they unfolded, Hood understood that this meant he was defeated, and before his army could be completely surrounded and trapped, he abandoned the city on September 2nd, 1864. Okay, so let's look at this. So Hood, you know the warrior that Hood is. Hood's in the Confederates. He realized what was going on, and he realized he was defeated. When he realized he was defeated he abandoned the city. So he just took off. Okay, and this was September 2nd, 1864. Hood abandoned the city, and the city officials surrendered the city to the Union. City officials surrendered city to the Union. Okay, so there was a series of battles. Sherman moved the Confederate Army outside of Atlanta. Sherman severed the railroad lines going to Atlanta. I should have put Hood. Right here when it says when he realized, I should have put when Hood realized. Apologize for that, but change that word to Hood. Okay, the Confederates, when Hood realized he was defeated, he just abandoned the city. September 2nd, 1864, city officials surrendered the city of Atlanta to the Union. Okay. Sherman sent a telegram to President Lincoln which read, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won." Sherman stayed there for a short time before ordering the entire population to evacuate the city. Once this was accomplished, he had it burned to the ground. Okay, so Sherman he sent a telegraph to President Lincoln telling him that they had Atlanta. Then he evacuated the city of Atlanta. Then he burned it to the ground. The capture of Atlanta had a profound impact on the war. Okay, so let's talk about the impact that this had on the war. Sorry. Impact of capturing Atlanta. Okay, well, politically, it enabled Lincoln to retain his office in the upcoming election. Lincoln held the presidency for second term. Okay. This was particularly important since anti-war Democrats had already vowed to settle the war if McClellan were elected president. The victory also greatly bolstered Northern morale as pictures of a burning Atlanta appeared in the newspapers. So, in other words, it gave him self-confidence. So, did I say bolstered? Is that the word it used? Yeah. Bolstered Northern morale. Third, the defeat of Atlanta broke the back of Confederate resistance. Its most industrialized city was in ruins. Okay, so it broke the back of the Confederates. Because Atlanta was their most industrialized city. Most industrialized city. You know, and it was destroyed. That really hurt the Confederates, which meant the Army had virtually no way to replenish any war materials. The burning of the city was only a precursor of events to come. So it was only the start. When it says it was only a precursor of the things to come, that meant it was only the start of the events that were going to happen. Okay. So we said that after the city officials surrendered Atlanta to the Union, Sherman sent a telegraph to Abraham Lincoln, told him they won the city. He evacuated Atlanta, and then he burned it to the ground. The impact of capturing Atlanta. Capturing Atlanta had many effects, many impacts. Lincoln held the president for the second term. It bolstered Northern morale, you know, because they would open the newspaper and they would see pictures of Atlanta burning. And it broke the back of the Confederates because Atlanta was their most industrialized cities, and now it's destroyed. Okay? So now let's talk about the Shenandoah Valley campaigns. The Valley campaigns of 1864 secured Washington, D.C. from any Southern invasion, in addition to removing the last vestiges of the Confederate Army from Western Virginia. It began in May of 1864 and ended in October of the same year. Altogether, there were 3 main campaigns fought in the Shenandoah Valley. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Shenandoah Valley campaigns. Make sure I spell this right. Shenandoah Valley campaigns. IGNS. Okay. And it said that there were 3 main campaigns. So we're going to talk about the Lynchburg campaign first. It said this consisted of 3 campaigns. The first we're going to talk about is the Lynchburg campaign. Okay, the Lynchburg campaign kicked things off when Grant dispatched Major General Francis Sigel to destroy a transportation center at Lynchburg, Virginia. His army of 10,000 men was met by a much smaller group, which included cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, and was defeated. This embarrassing loss cost him his job. Major General David Hunter was chosen to replace Sigel. Shortly afterward, he had VMI, Virginia Military Institute burned to the ground. Hunter then tried to take Lynchburg, but was repulsed by the newly arrived army of General Jubal Early. Alright, let's talk about this. So the Lynchburg campaign. Okay, so Grant is the Union. We have some names here that are going to be new, so I'm going to put you so you get them straight. Grant dispatched Major General Francis Sigel. So we have Major General Sigel. Okay. He told him to destroy a transportation center at Lynchburg. Went to Lynchburg. To destroy a transportation center. Okay, so he's supposed to go and destroy this transportation center. Okay. Now, he had an army of 10,000 men. So he had a pretty good sized army. Okay. Now, the Confederates, I'm going to put a C here, the Confederates sent cadets from Virginia Military Institute. Virginia Military Institute, which is also known as VWVMI. Defeated them. Okay, now this was a much smaller army. It was a much smaller group, and they defeated Major Sigel's men, and he had 10,000 soldiers. Okay. So Sigel was fired. So Sigel was replaced with General David Hunter. So General Hunter. Okay? So the Shenandoah Valley campaigns consisted of 3 campaigns. The first is the Lynchburg campaign. Union Major General Sigel went to Lynchburg to destroy a transportation center. He had 10,000 soldiers. The Confederates sent cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, which defeated the Union soldiers. Defeated this. So Sigel, now we're talking about the Union again. Remember, Sigel's Union. Sigel was replaced with General Hunter. Okay. Okay. So what Hunter does Hunter, and I'm going to put a U here. Union General Hunter he burned VMI to the ground. He burned Virginia Military Institute to the ground. And then he went and he tried to take Lynchburg. But was repulsed by the newly arrived army of General Jubal Early. So he also failed to take Lynchburg. Now, Early, remember, is a Confederate. Early had been sent by Lee to put a halt to Union advances in the area and perhaps attack Washington, D.C. He did as he was told, sweeping up the valley into Maryland. Early defeated the Union forces led by Lew Wallace in the Battle of Monocacy Junction. He was stopped on the outskirts of Washington. As he withdrew, Early burned Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, to the ground in retaliation for what Hunter did to the Virginia Military Institute. Okay, so Lee, the Confederates, sent, is he a general? He is a general. Okay, just making sure. He sent General Early to stop Union advances. General Early was sent to stop Union advances and attack Washington, D.C. And attack Washington, D.C. Okay. Okay, it says that he defeated Wallace in the Battle of Monocacy. General Early defeated Wallace in the Battle of Monocacy. He was stopped on the outskirts of Washington. So it's saying Early was stopped on the outskirts of Washington. So he got all the way to Washington, and as he withdrew, he burned Chambersburg. Okay, so Confederate General Early was stopped on the outskirts of Washington And it says he burned Chambersburg to the ground. Chambersburg. And this was in retaliation. Okay, the revenge of Virginia Military Institute. Okay, so he burned Chambersburg because they burned Virginia Military Institute. Okay. So we said Union General Hunter burned Virginia Military Institute to the ground. He failed to take Lynchburg because General Early stopped him. General Early was sent to stop the Union and attack Washington, D.C. General Early defeated Wallace in the Battle of Monocacy. The Confederate General Early was stopped on the outskirts of Washington, and while he was retreating, he burned Chambersburg. It was revenge of VMI. Okay. Tired of having Confederate forces so close to Washington, Grant decided to put an end to the threat. He called upon General Philip Sheridan, a cavalry commander. Sheridan was given command of the entire region in order to get rid of Early. A series of battles followed between the two commanders. They took turns hitting one another for 2 months before Sheridan gained the upper hand. He routed Early's troops at the Battle of Opequon and followed that up with another defeat at the Battle of Fisher's Hill 3 days later. Okay. So Grant sees Early as a threat. Grant didn't want the Confederates so close to Washington. So we're going to talk about the Union. Grant wanted Confederates away from Washington, D.C. And we know that's where our capital is. Okay. So he called upon General Philip Sheridan. General Sheridan. B-A-N. Okay. He ordered him to get rid of Early. So his job was to get rid of Early. Okay. So there's a series of battles between Sheridan and Early. The Union defeated Early at 2 battles. One of them is the Battle of Opequon. So the Battle of Opequon. And the Battle of Fisher's Hill. Okay. With the Shenandoah Valley now secured, Sheridan set about what is known as a scorched earth policy. He and his men headed north, burning any structure they came across. This effectively destroyed any means the Confederate Army might have for feeding itself in the future. Once the destruction was complete, Sheridan headed south to hook up with Grant's army that was besieging Petersburg. The remnants of Early's army joined Lee in the same battle. Okay. So now they have the scorched earth policy. Scorched earth policy. Which means they headed north, burning every structure they head north, burning every structure. And the purpose of this is so the Confederates couldn't use it later. So it prevented Confederates from taking it back or using it later. Okay? So we said that Grant, supposed to be a T, a lot of spelling errors, huh? Grant wanted the Confederates away from Washington, D.C. So he employed General Sheridan, and he told him to get rid of Early. The Union defeated Early in the Battle of Opequon and the Battle of Fisher's Hill. And then they incorporated the scorched earth policy, which means they headed north and burned every structure. This was to prevent the Confederates from using it later. Okay. It said, after they were finished with this, Sheridan hooked up with Grant's army, joined Grant's army, and it said Early's army joined Lee. The aftermath. Like a large net closing in on a school of fish, the Union forces were converging on the Confederate Army. In the east, a naval blockade had kept badly needed trade from arriving at southern ports. In the west, the mighty Mississippi River was in the northern hands, meaning no supplies would reach Confederate troops from that direction. Now in the south, Federal troops had captured Atlanta, opening the entire south to the ravages of its enemy. By the end of 1864, the net was nearly closed all around Lee and his army of Virginia. Okay, so let's look at this. So the Union was closing in on the Confederates. On Confederates. It said In the east, the naval blockade. Okay, naval blockade. A-D-E or A? Yeah, it's A-D-E. Okay, prevented trade. So they weren't getting any supplies from the east. And then it says, in the west, the Mississippi River that was in northern hands, so they weren't getting any supplies that way. And it said the south, remember they had Atlanta, but now Atlanta is destroyed. And this was their most industrialized city, so they weren't going to get any supplies from the south. Okay? So the Confederates were almost all the way blocked in. In addition, President Lincoln had been re-elected, meaning the war would continue to its bitter end. Northern forces were being replenished daily with fresh men and new supplies, and we said this several times. The Southern forces had run out of available bodies to man armies, and many owned no shoes, little clothing, less food, and few munitions to carry out a war. Despite the overwhelming odds against them, the Confederate Army rose to the occasion again and again. Everyone knew it would not be their resolve that caved in first. For the Union, there were only a couple of loose ends to tie down now. Sherman would continue to ravage the South while Grant kept Lee occupied in Petersburg. It would be Sherman who finally broke the Confederacy's back in the winter of 1864. Okay, so Sherman's going to continue to ravage the South. Sherman. Okay, he's going to continue to ravage the South. Remember, Grant's, he's from the Union, and Lee, he's from the South. They're still fighting in Petersburg. They're fighting in Petersburg. Okay? So we said after he burned Atlanta, and after he went north burning every structure he could, Sheridan joined Grant's army. Early's army joined Lee. The Union was closing in on the Confederates. In the east, the naval blockade prevented the Confederates from any trade. In the west, the Mississippi was in the northern hands, so the Confederates weren't going to get any supplies that way. In the south, the north had just destroyed Atlanta, so they weren't going to get any help that way. Sherman continued to ravage the south, while Grant and Lee are still fighting in Petersburg. Okay? Let's review. Two major campaigns took place during the summer and fall of 1864. The Atlanta campaign took place during the summer and involved a series of battles between Confederate Generals Johnson and Hood and Union General Sherman. The Federal Army slowly steered the Southern forces toward the city of Atlanta, Georgia. Once there, the Union forces captured the city and eventually burned it to the ground. The Valley campaigns of 1864 took place in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Here the Union forces of Sheridan and the Southern forces of Early struggled against one another in a series of battles that culminated with a soundly defeated Confederate army. Sheridan laid the valley to waste before returning to Grant and Petersburg. Early returned to Lee to help defend the city. The aftermath of these two campaigns was significant. For the North, they meant that Lincoln was re-elected, ensuring the war would continue. The morale of Northern citizens was greatly improved as they began to see an end to the war. For the South, the opposite was true. The two major losses ensured ultimate victory for the North, leaving the South devastated by war. The scorched earth policy practiced for Sheridan and soon to be duplicated by Sherman left the Confederacy with few natural resources to rely on. While the Union Army was being replenished daily, the Confederate Army had virtually nothing. Go back and review that lesson, study your notes, and answer the questions.